In a city where your race can make or break your dreams, one man's rejection became the catalyst for an unlikely success story. James, a black entrepreneur, watched his restaurant plans fall apart because of a biased official. But sometimes our greatest triumphs are born from our deepest failures. What James did next didn't just save his business, it revitalized a forgotten corner of the city and exposed the true cost of discrimination. James stood before the empty storefront, his reflection a ghostly reminder of his shattered dreams. The large windows, now dusty and streaked, once held visions of a bustling restaurant filled with the aroma of spices and the sound of laughter. He could almost taste the fusion dishes he'd spent years perfecting, a blend of his grandmother's soul food recipes and the vibrant flavors he'd discovered during his travels. His heart raced as he clutched the thick folder of permit applications and business plans. Months of meticulous preparation had led to this moment. James took a deep breath, steadying himself before pushing open the heavy door of the municipal building. The sterile fluorescent lights and cold linoleum floors did nothing to calm his nerves as he approached the permit office. The official behind the desk barely looked up as James entered, his face a mask of bored indifference. But as James handed over his application, something in the air shifted. The official's eyes narrowed as he scanned the papers, his lips tightening into a thin line. James felt a chill run down his spine, an instinctive recognition of the prejudice hiding behind that carefully neutral expression. "Mr. Thompson," the official said, his voice clipped and cold, "I'm afraid there are some issues with your application." James' heartbeat quickened, a sickening realization dawning. He'd seen that look before, felt that unspoken judgment. This wasn't about zoning laws or health codes. This was about the color of his skin. "What issues?" James asked, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I've triple-checked everything. It's all in order." The official's eyes never left the paper as he spoke, listing off vague concerns and minor technicalities. But James heard the unspoken message loud and clear: "You don't belong here. Not in this neighborhood. Not with this dream." Tension crackled in the air as James fought to control his rising anger. He'd anticipated challenges, but not this, not such blatant, thinly veiled discrimination. His mind raced, searching for the right words to challenge the official's decision without burning bridges he might still need, but it was futile. With each passing moment, James watched his carefully laid plans crumble before his eyes. The permit was denied, crushed under the weight of systemic racism masquerading as bureaucracy. James walked out of the office, his legs feeling leaden, his mind reeling. The folder that had once held so much promise now felt like a mockery in his hands. He stood on the sidewalk, staring unseeing at the bustling street before him for a moment. Despair threatened to overwhelm him. All those late nights, the savings poured into this dream, the encouragement of his family, was it all for nothing? But as the initial shock began to fade, something else stirred within James. His hands clenched into fists, a fire of determination burning in his eyes. This setback wouldn't be the end of his story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where he'd prove that official, and everyone like him, wrong. James took one last look at the vibrant neighborhood he'd hoped to call home. Then he turned and walked away, his mind already formulating a new plan. He didn't know it yet, but his next steps would change not just his own fate, but the future of an entire community. They say one man's trash is another man's treasure. But what about an entire neighborhood left to rot? James stood at the edge of a forgotten world, wondering if his shattered dream could take root in these crumbling streets. The stench hit him first, a noxious blend of garbage and decay that made his eyes water. Broken glass crunched under his feet as he ventured deeper into the forgotten district. Graffiti-covered walls loomed on either side, their once vibrant colors faded and peeling. Boarded-up storefronts lined the street, their windows dark and empty. James felt a chill run down his spine as he took in the desolation. This was a far cry from the bustling neighborhood he'd originally envisioned for his restaurant. But as he walked, something stirred within him, a spark of possibility amidst the urban decay. He paused before a dilapidated building, its brick facade crumbling and weathered. The faded "For Lease" sign in the grimy window seemed more like a plea than an offer. James peered inside, his mind already racing with possibilities. The space was a mess, water damage stained the ceiling, and debris littered the floor. But beneath the layers of neglect, he could see the bones of something beautiful. A flicker of movement caught his eye. A young mother hurried past, clutching her child's hand tightly as she navigated the broken sidewalk. Their eyes met briefly, and James saw a mix of wariness and resignation in her gaze. This neighborhood had been abandoned by those in power, left to fend for itself against the ravages of time and poverty. James felt a familiar fire ignite in his chest. He'd faced rejection and discrimination, but this was a different kind of challenge. Could he really stake his future on such a risky venture? The smart move would be to walk away, to find a safer bet. But as he stood there, surrounded by the echoes of forgotten dreams, James knew he couldn't turn his back on this place. He closed his eyes, imagining the transformation. In his mind's eye, he saw fresh paint brightening the walls, the aroma of spices wafting through open windows. He heard the laughter of families enjoying a meal together, the excited chatter of neighbors reconnecting. This wasn't just about his restaurant anymore. It was about breathing life back into a community that had been left behind. The risks were enormous. James knew he'd be starting from scratch, facing not just the usual challenges of opening a restaurant, but the added hurdles of revitalizing a neglected area. Every penny of his savings would be on the line. And there was no guarantee that customers would be willing to venture into this part of town, no matter how good his food might be. But as he opened his eyes, taking in the stark reality of the forgotten district once more, James felt a sense of calm settle over him. This was where he belonged. This was where his dream could not only survive but thrive, growing into something far greater than he'd originally imagined. A glimmer of hope shone in James' eyes as he surveyed his potential new home. He pulled out his phone, fingers trembling slightly as he dialed the number on the "For Lease" sign. It was time to take the biggest risk of his life, and potentially change the fate of an entire neighborhood in the process. With the lease signed, James stood alone in the cavernous, decrepit space. The stale air hung heavy with decades of neglect. He took a deep breath, tasting dust and mold, and wondered, could he really transform this urban wasteland into the vibrant heart of a reborn community? James rolled up his sleeves, determination etched on his face. The task ahead was monumental, but he had no choice but to succeed. He grabbed a sledgehammer and swung it at the crumbling drywall, sending a cloud of dust into the air. His muscles screamed in protest, but James pushed through the pain. Each strike brought him closer to his dream. Days turned into weeks, and James worked tirelessly. His hands became a map of calluses and cuts, testament to the grueling labor. He tore out rotting floorboards, replacing them with sturdy planks. The electrical system was a nightmare of frayed wires and outdated fixtures. James spent sleepless nights studying building codes, determined to do as much of the work himself as possible to save money. But just as James began to see progress, disaster struck. A heavy rainstorm revealed major leaks in the roof, threatening to undo weeks of work. Water pooled on the newly installed floors, and James felt his heart sink. The cost of repairs would drain what little remained of his savings. He sat on the damp floor, head in his hands, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. The next morning, James arrived to find a small crowd gathered outside. Word had spread about his project, and curious neighbors had come to see for themselves. An elderly woman approached, introducing herself as Ms. Johnson. "We've been watching you work, young man," she said, her eyes twinkling. "This place hasn't seen so much life in years." Encouraged by the community's interest, James pushed forward. He hired local teens to help with the cleanup, teaching them basic construction skills in the process. The work was slow and arduous, but slowly the space began to take shape. James' vision of exposed brick walls and warm wood tones started to materialize, yet the setbacks kept coming. A routine inspection revealed issues with the foundation, requiring expensive reinforcement. James' carefully planned budget was in tatters. He took on odd jobs in the evenings, working himself to exhaustion just to keep the project afloat. There were nights when he collapsed on the half-finished floor, too tired to make the trip home. As the renovation entered its final stages, James faced a moment of truth. His funds were depleted, and there was still so much to do. The kitchen equipment alone would cost more than he had left. James paced the space, his dream so close yet still out of reach. He couldn't give up now, not after everything he'd sacrificed. In a last-ditch effort, James reached out to the community. He organized a fundraising dinner, cooking on portable burners to give people a taste of what was to come. The response was overwhelming. Neighbors who had initially been skeptical now saw the potential for what this restaurant could mean for their forgotten corner of the city. With the community's support and his own unwavering determination, James pushed through the final hurdles. He worked around the clock, fueled by a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. And finally, after months of back-breaking labor and countless obstacles, the renovation was complete. James stood in the doorway of his finished restaurant, tears welling in his eyes. The space was unrecognizable from the abandoned shell he'd first encountered. Warm lighting glinted off polished surfaces, and the aroma of his test recipes lingered in the air. It wasn't just a restaurant, it was a beacon of possibility, a symbol of rebirth for a long-neglected neighborhood. Against all odds, James had turned his dream into reality, one painful, persevering step at a time. James stood at the gleaming stainless steel counter, his hands moving with practiced precision as he added the final garnish to his signature dish. The aroma of spices filled the air, a tantalizing blend of familiar comfort and exotic intrigue. His heart raced as he surveyed the menu one last time, wondering if his culinary vision would resonate with the neighborhood. The fusion cuisine James had created was unlike anything else in the city. He'd taken the soul food recipes passed down through generations of his family and infused them with flavors from his travels around the world. Collard greens were reimagined with a hint of lemongrass and ginger. Fried chicken got a makeover with a crispy coating of Indian spices. And his grandmother's sweet potato pie now had a whisper of cardamom and a dollop of coconut cream. As James arranged the last of the place settings, doubt crept in. Would the locals embrace such bold flavors? Or would they see his creations as a betrayal of tradition? He'd poured his heart and soul into this menu, but in a neighborhood unaccustomed to fine dining, there was no guarantee of success. The first customers trickled in hesitantly, their eyes widening as they took in the transformed space. James watched from the kitchen, his palms sweating as the waitstaff explained the concept. He held his breath as the first plates left the kitchen, praying his gamble would pay off. A hush fell over the dining room as forks clinked against plates. James peered through the kitchen door, searching for reactions. And then, like a wave breaking, the silence gave way to a burst of excited chatter. He saw eyes closing in delight, heard murmurs of appreciation, watched as diners eagerly passed forkfuls to their companions. As the night wore on, the tiny restaurant filled to capacity. Word spread quickly, and curious neighbors poked their heads in, drawn by the enticing aromas and the sound of laughter. James barely had time to catch his breath as he raced to keep up with the orders flooding in. By closing time, James was exhausted but exhilarated. He stepped out into the dining room, now empty save for a few lingering customers. An elderly woman who had watched the restaurant's transformation with skepticism approached him, her eyes shining. "Young man," she said, clasping his hand, "I didn't know what to expect when I came in here tonight. But let me tell you, that was the best meal I've had in years. You've brought something special to this neighborhood." James felt a lump form in his throat. He'd taken a massive risk, both in location and concept. But as he looked around at the satisfied faces and lively atmosphere, he knew he'd made the right choice. His culinary revolution had begun, and with it, the first stirrings of change in a long-neglected corner of the city. As the last customers bid their goodnights, promises to return already on their lips, James allowed himself a moment of quiet triumph. He'd faced rejection, battled seemingly insurmountable odds, and poured every ounce of his being into this dream. Now, with the lingering scent of spices in the air and the warmth of community filling the space, he knew that this was only the beginning. Word would spread, drawing curious diners from across the city to this unlikely culinary oasis. And with each satisfied customer, each shared meal, James' vision of revitalization through food would grow stronger, nourishing not just bodies, but the very soul of a forgotten neighborhood. The aroma of success hung in the air, but James had no idea of the storm brewing just beyond his kitchen doors. In a world where a single photo could make or break a restaurant, who would be the first to capture the essence of his culinary revolution? James wiped his brow, surveying the packed dining room. The hum of conversation and clinking cutlery filled the air, a symphony of satisfied patrons. His eyes landed on a young woman in the corner, her phone hovering over her plate. She took a bite, and her eyes widened. In an instant, her fingers flew across the screen, capturing every angle of the dish. Word spread like wildfire. Food bloggers and social media influencers descended on the restaurant, their cameras flashing and followers growing. James felt a mixture of pride and terror as glowing reviews flooded online platforms. A hidden gem in the most unexpected place, one critic raved. James has created more than just a meal, he's crafted an experience that challenges everything we thought we knew about fusion cuisine. The pressure mounted with each passing day. James and his small team worked tirelessly to maintain the quality that had earned them such sudden fame. Every plate had to be perfect, every customer interaction flawless. James found himself spending more time in the kitchen than ever, perfecting recipes and training staff to handle the influx of diners. As the restaurant's popularity soared, so did the challenges. Reservations became nearly impossible to secure, with wait times stretching into months. James grappled with the idea of expansion, torn between maintaining the intimate atmosphere he'd created and meeting the growing demand. The neighborhood, once wary of change, now buzzed with a new energy. Other businesses began to take notice, eyeing the once-forgotten district with newfound interest. James watched with a mixture of pride and concern as "For Rent" signs disappeared from nearby storefronts. One evening, as the last customers lingered over dessert, James stepped out for a breath of fresh air. He was shocked to find a line snaking around the block, people waiting for the next day's lunch service. A group of teenagers excitedly discussed which dishes they hoped to try, while an elderly couple reminisced about how the neighborhood used to be. James felt a lump form in his throat. His dream had grown beyond anything he could have imagined. But as he looked at the diverse crowd gathered outside his door, he realized that his success wasn't just about the food. He'd created a space where people from all walks of life could come together, breaking down barriers one meal at a time. Returning to the kitchen, James gathered his team. "We've come so far," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But we can't lose sight of why we started this. It's not just about the acclaim or the crowds. It's about building something meaningful for our community." As they nodded in agreement, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. The viral fame might fade, but the impact they were making on the neighborhood, and on each person who walked through their doors, would last far longer than any online review. James' vision had sparked a flame, but would that flame warm the community or burn it down? As paint cans and scaffolding appeared on neighboring buildings, a complex transformation began to unfold, one that would test the very foundations of the neighborhood James had grown to love. The once desolate street now hummed with activity. Fresh coats of vibrant paint brightened storefronts that had stood empty for years. The clatter of construction echoed through the air as entrepreneurs, inspired by James' success, rushed to stake their claim in the area's rebirth. A trendy coffee shop opened its doors next to a boutique selling locally made crafts. Even the crumbling park at the end of the block saw new life, with volunteers planting flowers and repairing long-neglected playground equipment. But beneath the surface of progress, tension simmered. James noticed the wary glances from longtime residents as they passed by the new businesses. He overheard hushed conversations about rising rents and the fear of being pushed out. The very changes that breathed new life into the neighborhood threatened to displace those who had called it home for generations. One afternoon, as James stepped out to greet the lunch crowd, he found Ms. Johnson, the elderly neighbor who had first welcomed him, staring at a "for sale" sign in front of her apartment building. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I've lived here for 40 years, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now they're saying the rent's going up. Where am I supposed to go?" Her words hit James like a punch to the gut. He had dreamed of revitalizing the area, but not at the cost of pushing out its heart and soul. The realization weighed heavily on him as he navigated the packed dining room, serving plates of his signature fusion cuisine to a mix of excited newcomers and apprehensive locals. That night, unable to sleep, James paced the restaurant floor. The gleaming surfaces and stylish decor that had once filled him with pride now felt hollow. He knew he had to act, to find a way to ensure that the neighborhood's transformation benefited everyone, not just those with deep pockets. Over the next weeks, James threw himself into community organizing with the same passion he'd poured into his restaurant. He reached out to other business owners, both old and new, to form a coalition dedicated to responsible development. They worked with local officials to draft policies protecting long-term residents from skyrocketing rents. James offered free cooking classes to neighborhood youth, teaching them skills that could lead to jobs in the burgeoning restaurant scene. The path forward wasn't easy. There were heated debates at town hall meetings and skepticism from both sides. But slowly, a sense of shared purpose began to emerge. James watched with pride as Ms. Johnson cut the ribbon on a community garden, her face beaming as she showed children how to plant tomatoes in soil that had once been nothing but weeds and broken glass. As the sun set on another busy day, James stood in the doorway of his restaurant, taking in the transformed street. The changes were undeniable, but so too was the spirit of the community that had weathered decades of neglect. He saw old-timers chatting with newcomers on freshly painted stoops, sharing stories and building connections. The air buzzed with possibility, tinged with the spices from James' kitchen and the aroma of a neighborhood finding its new identity. James knew the work was far from over. Balancing progress with preservation would be an ongoing challenge. But as he watched a group of local kids excitedly planning their own business venture, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about his own success anymore. It was about nurturing a community where everyone could thrive, where the bonds between neighbors were as strong as the new foundations rising from the once crumbling streets. They say karma comes for everyone eventually. For the official who had tried to crush James' dreams, that day arrived with a stack of damning reports and the quiet whispers of discontent. How had his once thriving district fallen so far behind, while the area he'd written off was now the talk of the town? The official shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, his eyes fixed on the report spread across his desk. The numbers stared back at him, cold and unforgiving. Vacancy rates in his district had skyrocketed, tax revenues were plummeting, and business owners were fleeing in droves. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, his stomach churning with a mix of anger and fear. Outside his office window, the contrast was stark. Empty storefronts lined the streets, their windows plastered with "for rent" signs that seemed to mock him. A frustrated business owner paced in front of his shop, gesticulating wildly as he argued with a real estate agent. The once bustling sidewalks were eerily quiet, save for the occasional group of teenagers with nowhere else to go. The official's mind raced, searching for excuses, for someone to blame. But deep down, he knew the truth. His outdated policies and narrow-minded approach had strangled the life out of this neighborhood. While he had been busy protecting the status quo, the world had moved on without him. His phone rang, startling him out of his spiral of self-pity. It was the mayor's office, demanding answers about the district's poor performance. The official fumbled for words, his usual confidence evaporating. As he stammered through weak explanations, he could almost hear the skepticism on the other end of the line. Word was spreading fast. In the corridors of City Hall, hushed conversations fell silent as he passed. Colleagues who once sought his favor now avoided eye contact. The whispers grew louder with each passing day. rumors of misconduct, of decisions based on prejudice rather than merit, and always, there was talk of James and his thriving restaurant. The official had dismissed him without a second thought, but now James' success was a glaring indictment of his own failings. Every glowing review, every packed reservation list, was another nail in the coffin of his reputation. As he sat in his dimly lit office late one evening, the weight of his actions finally came crashing down. The discrimination he had justified as protecting the neighborhood had backfired spectacularly. He had not only denied opportunities to deserving individuals but had also robbed his own district of potential growth and innovation. The official stared at his reflection in the darkened window, barely recognizing the man looking back at him. He had a choice to make. Would he continue down this path of denial and prejudice, watching his career and his district crumble around him? Or would he find the courage to admit his mistakes and work towards real change? Outside, the first stars appeared in the evening sky. In another part of the city, James' restaurant hummed with life and possibility. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. As the official gathered his things to leave, he knew that the reckoning had only just begun. The tables had turned, and the true cost of discrimination was finally coming due. The stars twinkling over the city seemed to herald a new era, but the dawn would bring more than just light. A storm was brewing in the hearts and minds of citizens, ready to break open decades of silence. What happens when a city can no longer ignore the elephant in the room? The town hall erupted in a cacophony of voices, each fighting to be heard over the din. James sat in the back, his heart racing as he watched the scene unfold. His story had ignited a powder keg of emotions, forcing the city to confront the ugly truth of systemic racism that had festered beneath the surface for far too long. On one side of the room, longtime residents shared painful stories of discrimination, their voices trembling with a mix of anger and relief at finally being heard. An elderly woman gripped the microphone tightly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears as she recounted decades of being passed over for jobs and housing opportunities. A young man, his fists clenched at his sides, described the constant fear and humiliation of being profiled by law enforcement. Across the aisle, defensive murmurs rippled through a group of business owners and city officials. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others argued that the city's problems were being exaggerated. The tension in the air was palpable, threatening to snap at any moment. Mayor Thompson stood at the podium, her face a mask of carefully controlled neutrality. But James could see the strain in her eyes as she tried to maintain order. "We're here to listen," she said, her voice barely audible over the crowd. "And to find a path forward together." As the night wore on, the raw emotions began to give way to something deeper. Citizens from all walks of life stepped up to share their experiences and ideas. A teacher spoke passionately about the need for more diverse curricula in schools. A former police officer, his voice heavy with regret, called for major reforms in law enforcement training. James felt a glimmer of hope as he watched bridges being built across long-standing divides. But he knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. The city needed concrete action to address years of systemic inequality. In the weeks that followed, the conversations continued. Community forums sprang up in every neighborhood, drawing both supporters and skeptics. Local businesses grappled with their own hiring practices, while city departments faced uncomfortable scrutiny of their policies. The process was messy and often painful. Old wounds were reopened, and progress sometimes felt agonizingly slow. But there was an undeniable energy in the air, a sense that real change might finally be possible. Finally, after months of heated debate and careful negotiation, Mayor Thompson announced the formation of a special task force. Its mission: to conduct a thorough investigation into discriminatory practices within city government and develop actionable recommendations for reform. As James watched the press conference on TV, he felt a mix of emotions wash over him. Pride at the role his story had played in sparking this movement. Anxiety about the challenges that still lay ahead. And most of all, a cautious optimism that his city might finally be taking its first real steps toward becoming a place of true equality and opportunity for all. James' story had ignited a spark, and now that spark was growing into a wildfire of change. As the sun rose on a new day in the city, a young black entrepreneur named Alicia stood before the permit office, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She clutched her business plan tightly, drawing strength from the memory of James' triumph. Alicia took a deep breath and pushed open the heavy glass door. The sterile fluorescent lights flickered overhead as she approached the counter. The clerk's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. Alicia felt her palms grow clammy, but she refused to back down. She thought of James, of all he had overcome, and found her voice. "I'm here to apply for a business permit," she said, her words clear and unwavering. Across the city, similar scenes were unfolding. Minority business owners who had long accepted unfair treatment as an unchangeable reality were finding the courage to speak up. At the Department of Health, a Latinx restaurant owner challenged arbitrary inspections that seemed to target only immigrant-owned establishments. In the zoning office, an Asian American developer questioned why his projects faced constant delays while others sailed through. The city government found itself facing a flood of discrimination complaints and potential lawsuits. Emergency meetings were called as officials scrambled to address the growing crisis. In boardrooms and back offices, heated debates erupted over how to handle this sudden surge of accountability. "We can't just ignore this," argued Councilwoman Martinez, her voice rising with passion. "These people have valid concerns. If we don't address them now, we're looking at years of legal battles and a complete breakdown of trust in our institutions." Others pushed back, clinging to the old ways of doing things. "We can't change our entire system overnight just because a few people are complaining," grumbled one longtime bureaucrat, but the tide of public opinion was turning. As more stories of systemic discrimination came to light, citizens from all backgrounds began to demand change. Protests sprang up outside government buildings, their chants echoing through the streets. Social media buzzed with hashtags calling for reform and equal treatment. The mayor's office found itself besieged by reporters seeking comment on the growing controversy. How would the city adapt to this new era of accountability? The pressure for concrete action mounted with each passing day. Finally, after weeks of intense negotiations and public pressure, the city announced sweeping changes to its business licensing procedures. New oversight committees were established to ensure fair treatment for all applicants. Training programs on unconscious bias became mandatory for all government employees involved in permitting and inspections. As word of the new policy spread, a sense of cautious optimism rippled through previously marginalized communities. People who had long felt invisible or powerless began to see a glimmer of hope for real change. Back at the permit office, Alicia emerged with her approved application in hand, her eyes shining with triumph. She looked around at the diverse faces in the waiting area, each person carrying their own dreams and aspirations. For the first time in a long while, the air hummed with possibility instead of resignation. The ripple effect of James' stand against injustice had grown into a wave, washing away old barriers and creating new opportunities. While challenges remained, the city had taken its first steps towards becoming a place where everyone had a fair shot at success. With the wave of change James had sparked now sweeping through the city, his own journey was far from over. As he stood before a room full of eager faces, James realized he held the key to unlocking a future even brighter than the one he'd fought so hard to create. What would he do with this newfound power? James' eyes scanned the crowd of aspiring entrepreneurs hanging on his every word. Their faces reflected a mix of hope and determination, reminding him of his own early struggles. He felt the weight of their expectations, knowing that his story had become a beacon of possibility for so many. "Success isn't just about making it to the top," James said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "It's about reaching back and pulling others up with you." As he shared the hard-won lessons of his journey, James felt a familiar fire ignite in his chest. He saw the spark of recognition in their eyes, the silent nods of those who had faced similar obstacles. But even as he poured his heart into mentoring these future business leaders, a nagging worry tugged at the back of his mind. Back at the restaurant, the dinner rush was in full swing. James' phone buzzed incessantly with messages from his staff, each one a reminder of the delicate balance he was trying to maintain. He had built something extraordinary, but its very success now threatened to pull him away from the community he'd worked so hard to uplift. James threw himself into creating new opportunities for minority entrepreneurs. He partnered with local banks to develop microloan programs, worked with the city to streamline the permitting process, and offered his restaurant as a training ground for aspiring chefs and restaurateurs. With each initiative, he saw the ripple effects of his efforts spreading through the community, but the demands on his time and energy were relentless. Late nights at the restaurant bled into early morning mentoring sessions. James found himself stretched thin, torn between the immediate needs of his business and his growing role as a community leader. As weeks turned into months, James grappled with a pivotal question: how could he ensure that his impact would outlast his individual efforts? He knew that true change required more than just inspiration, it needed sustainable support and resources. The answer came to him during a quiet moment in the kitchen, as he watched a young trainee master a difficult technique. James realized that his legacy could be so much more than just his own success story. With renewed purpose, James began laying the groundwork for a foundation dedicated to supporting minority entrepreneurs. He envisioned a comprehensive program that would provide not just funding, but also mentorship, training, and ongoing support. As news of the foundation spread, James watched with pride as a new generation of diverse business owners began to emerge. Their ventures ranged from tech startups to artisanal bakeries, each one contributing to the vibrant tapestry of the city's evolving economic landscape. Standing on the steps of City Hall, surrounded by the first cohort of foundation graduates, James felt a profound sense of fulfillment. He had transformed his own dream into a reality, and now he was helping others do the same. As he looked out at the faces of these new entrepreneurs, James knew that the true measure of his success would be the thriving, diverse community they would build together. The city pulsed with newfound energy, its streets alive with color and possibility. Where decay once reigned, vibrant murals now adorned weathered brick walls, telling stories of resilience and rebirth. Bustling sidewalks echoed with the chatter of diverse voices, a symphony of languages and cultures blending into a harmonious whole. James walked down a street he barely recognized, marveling at the transformation. A trendy coffee shop had taken root in a once-abandoned storefront, its windows steamed with the aroma of fresh roasted beans. Next door, a community art center buzzed with activity, children's laughter spilling onto the sidewalk as they created masterpieces of their own. The city's reputation was growing, whispers of its inclusive spirit and innovative approach spreading far beyond its borders. Tech startups and social enterprises flocked to the area, drawn by the promise of a level playing field and a community that embraced change. But with this rapid growth came inevitable growing pains. James felt the tension in the air as he passed a group of longtime residents huddled in worried conversation. Their eyes darted to the sleek new apartment complex rising at the end of the block, its modern lines a stark contrast to the weathered charm of their homes. The fear of displacement hung heavy, a shadow threatening to dim the bright future they'd fought so hard to create. In the city council chambers, heated debates raged over how to manage the influx of new businesses while protecting the soul of the community. Zoning laws were rewritten, then challenged, then rewritten again. The delicate balance between progress and preservation teetered on a knife's edge. James found himself caught in the middle, his success both a beacon of hope and a lightning rod for criticism. He attended community meetings, listening to impassioned pleas from both sides. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, knowing that his voice carried influence in shaping the city's future. As the sun set on another day of rapid change, James stood at the window of his restaurant, watching the ebb and flow of life on the streets below. He couldn't help but wonder, could the city maintain this momentum without losing its heart? Would the progress they'd made crumble under the weight of its own success? The answer came not in grand gestures, but in small acts of community. A developer working with local artists to incorporate affordable studio spaces into their new building. A tech company partnering with the neighborhood school to offer coding classes. Longtime residents and newcomers coming together to plant trees along once barren streets. Slowly, carefully, a comprehensive plan began to take shape. It wasn't perfect, and there were still heated arguments and compromises to be made. But at its core was a commitment to equitable growth, to ensuring that the rising tide truly lifted all boats. As James locked up the restaurant that night, he felt a surge of pride and cautious optimism. The city wasn't just being reborn, it was evolving into something entirely new. A model of what was possible when barriers were torn down and everyone had a seat at the table. The journey was far from over, but with each passing day, the dream of a truly inclusive and thriving community inched closer to reality. As James stood at the window of his restaurant, gazing out at the bustling street below, memories of that fateful day years ago flooded back. The sting of rejection, the crushing weight of discrimination, it all felt so vivid, yet so distant. His fingers traced the smooth surface of the countertop, a tangible reminder of how far he'd come. The neighborhood pulsed with life, a stark contrast to the desolation he'd first encountered. Colorful murals adorned once crumbling walls, telling stories of resilience and hope. The air hummed with the chatter of diverse voices, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter from the nearby community center. James closed his eyes, letting the memories wash over him. The long nights of demolition and renovation, his hands blistered and bleeding. The nervous energy of opening day, wondering if anyone would show up. The first glowing review that made his heart soar. Each moment, a battle won in a war against prejudice and doubt. But even as pride swelled in his chest, James knew the fight was far from over. Old biases ran deep, threatening to resurface at any moment. He'd seen it in the wary glances of some longtime residents, heard it in the hushed conversations at city council meetings. The progress they'd made was fragile, balanced on a knife's edge of understanding and mutual respect. A young woman caught his eye as she hurried past the window, her arms laden with blueprints. James recognized her as one of the entrepreneurs he'd mentored, now on the verge of opening her own business. Her determined stride mirrored his own from years ago, a reminder that his journey had become so much more than personal success. The impact of his perseverance rippled out far beyond the confines of his restaurant. It lived in the thriving businesses that now lined the street, in the renewed sense of community pride, in the faces of children who could now dream bigger than their parents ever dared. James' phone buzzed, jolting him back to the present. A news alert flashed across the screen. Another city across the country was adopting policies inspired by their success story. His heart raced as he read the details, realizing that their local triumph was sparking change on a national scale. The weight of this legacy settled on James' shoulders, both exhilarating and daunting. What started as one man's refusal to give up had become a rallying cry for communities everywhere. His story was being shared in classrooms, boardrooms, and city halls, challenging others to confront their own biases and fight for change. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the vibrant street, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey ahead would be challenging, filled with setbacks and hard-won victories. But he was no longer walking alone. A community stood with him, united in their determination to build a future where everyone had a chance to thrive. James turned away from the window, rolling up his sleeves. There was still work to be done, battles to be fought. But with each small act of perseverance, with each person inspired to stand up and make a difference, they inched closer to the world they dared to imagine. A world where rejection became the catalyst for revolution, and where no dream was too big to pursue. James stood at the window of his restaurant, gazing out at the transformed neighborhood. The once derelict street now pulsed with life, a testament to the power of perseverance in the face of adversity. His fingers traced the smooth countertop, each groove a reminder of the battles he'd fought and won. The air hummed with the chatter of diverse voices, punctuated by laughter from the nearby community center. Colorful murals adorned walls that had once been crumbling, telling stories of resilience and hope. James closed his eyes, letting the memories wash over him, the sting of rejection, the grueling nights of renovation, the nervous energy of opening day. His journey had become more than personal success. It lived in the thriving businesses lining the street, in the renewed sense of community pride, in the faces of children who could now dream bigger than their parents ever dared. James' refusal to give up had sparked a movement, challenging others to confront their biases and fight for change. As the sun dipped below the horizon, James felt the weight of his legacy settle on his shoulders. What started as one man's dream had become a rallying cry for communities everywhere. The road ahead would be challenging, but he was no longer walking alone. With each small act of perseverance, they inched closer to a world where rejection could become the catalyst for revolution.